Good morning. Welcome. Hope you guys are all doing well this week. Looks like we finally have some spring weather on the radar, so that's exciting. I can see a couple of you, so just a reminder, if you're available for turning your camera on, I would love, yeah, I see your note, Emma. Thank you for letting me know. If you can turn your camera on, though, I would appreciate it. Just helps us feel a little more connected in the virtual space. So I just want to start with taking a few minutes to sort of recap what you all went over asynchronously last week. We won't spend much time on it, but I do want to just hit the highlights, make sure that everybody got what they needed. So the first class session that was asynchronous was around violence and abuse in relationships, right? And the text brought out a number of factors, some cultural factors, some individual factors, and also familial factors that might contribute to abuse in a relationship, or an individual finding themselves in an abusive relationship. But what I really want to kind of hone in on is that cycle of abuse that was, there's a graphic in the PowerPoint, and then there was also an article linked about that. Would anybody be able to unmute and kind of talk us through in layman's terms what that cycle of abuse, looks like, feels like, how it keeps someone in an abusive relationship? I'm pulling it up right now so that you can see it, just to have the visual. Can anyone talk about their understanding of this model? No takers, huh? Okay, so
did you say what keeps them in the relationship?
Yeah, just kind of explaining how the cycle of abuse functions to keep someone in an abusive relationship.
Oh, well, I think it may be that people don't realize it's abuse until maybe someone tells them, or maybe until it gets too bad, and then maybe that's like people think, oh well, this is what I deserve, or this is how love is supposed to be, and they don't, I guess it's just hard for them to get out of it because that's what they think that like maybe should be going on.
Yeah, I definitely think, thank you, Adelaide, that you kind of oftentimes, I think people don't know until it's, they're so far into it that they can't really untangle themselves from the situation. And part of that experience of, not really recognizing it for what it is until it's maybe too late or it's gone so far is related to this model that you can see on the screen. And it's particularly related to the points that come out in number 3 and number 4, right? So there is this cycle that happens in abusive relationships where the partners, it's kind of like, the undercurrent of tension, the simmer before something starts to boil over, right? The tensions are building and building and building. And then there's this incident of either verbal, emotional, or physical abuse. That's the boiling over point, right? But then it's always followed in abusive relationships, it's followed by reconciliation, where the abuser, comforts the victim, gives excuses, maybe blames the victim, puts off that it was their fault. They might gaslight the victim and minimize the incident. But however that reconciliation occurs, it's followed by this period of calm, right? Where the incident itself, the abuse, is overlooked, forgotten. And there's often what they call in the book a honeymoon phase following that period of reconciliation. And in the calm, there's often this honeymoon phase that kind of reignites the relationship, and that's what kind of keeps people in, right, is this cycle. But it's that calm, you know, is always in an abusive relationship going to be followed then by another period of that simmer where tensions build, and then there will be another incident followed by reconciliation and calm, and it just keeps going in a really, you know, toxic sort of way. And I do want to just point out on this terminology, aperiodic reinforcement. So that's a term from the field of psychology, right? I imagine that most of you probably understand principles of reinforcement and punishment, and aperiodic reinforcement. So punishment and reinforcement are pretty black and white. They always happen traditionally. When the stimulus is presented, it's followed by the reinforcement or the punishment, and that's how organisms or individuals learn, you know, that stimulus equals response, right? But aperiodic, or in psychology, it's also called intermittent reinforcement. It's the most unpredictable. Okay, so you don't know if the incident or when the incident might be followed by reinforcement, or you know, so it's, and that keeps people, it keeps animals very much attentive to the stimulus and responding to the stimulus in the hope that they will get reinforced eventually. And that aperiodic reinforcement in an abusive relationship, you know, it kind of looks like what's going on in that honeymoon phase where the partner is doting on the victim, you know, maybe bringing flowers, those kinds of gestures that are kind of above and beyond. And it's in an effort to just keep that person, you know, caught in the cycle, if you will. I saw a hand raised. I think Haley, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment again about the cycle, and I was going to point out that like I feel like the calm is one of the most important stages, because that's kind of when people like forget about everything and they're just so happy in that honeymoon phase that they're kind of maybe not okay with the abuse, but they kind of just dismiss it because of that brief calm period.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And you know, and that is the sort of the trap, is that calm period. Um, and it tends to be one of those ways by which, I mean, people typically, I think most people in abusive relationships, and maybe not initially, but you know, you can look back over time and see, oh, this was a red flag, you know, this was probably not okay treatment, whatever. And I think as the cycle progresses, people do tend to kind of recognize what's happening, but that period of calm, it just kind of erases the incident for them, and they, um, yeah, and in that calm phase, someone just put in the chat that they think it won't happen again, you know, and so they think, oh, okay, that was it. This is the romance part now, and that's how they get stuck. Yeah. And then someone put in the chat, Sarah, I will also speak to this, that it's important to mention that the article pointed out that this cycle was written mostly through the lens of looking at heterosexual relationships in which the man is the abuser. But it is important to note, and our book talks about, right, if you read the chapter, the book talks about the fact that men are not always the abuser in partner relationships, in heterosexual relationships, right? And there's not very much research out there that helps us understand what it looks like when the woman is the aggressor and the man is the victim, partially because men don't necessarily self-report or talk about that as much as women do when they've come out of an abusive relationship. And also there's not a lot of research that speaks to how this plays out in homosexual or bisexual relationships, and all those different, excuse me, types of relationships that we've talked about to this point. So yeah, it is really important to kind of note the lens that this is coming through. But I think the psychological patterns probably apply, you know, to any sort of unhealthy patterns of relationships. Yes, and then someone also added in the chat that, you know, the apology coming from the partner kind of reinforces the idea that the partner can be good and might change. Um, and if I've learned anything in my, you know, decade of being married, it's that people do change, but not because you know, want them to or hope they will. And so, you know, if you're hanging on, waiting for someone to be better, probably need to look at how you can best take care of yourself. Um, did someone else raise their hand?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
So, because I've heard that like kids who come from like an abusive family, like it's easier for them to fall into that when they get into like relationships in the future. Is that why? Because all they know is that cycle?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cycle definitely contributes to it. And when we have experiences, so that, and we're going to actually talk about some of these today in our parenting conversation, but that piece about adverse childhood experiences, right? So being in the home with violence and abuse is an adverse childhood experience. And that really can, it can impact how we view people, how we view relationships, kind of our really foundational understanding of how people should interact with one another. And so oftentimes, and then, you know, we've talked in this course already about how we might look for a partner who exemplifies the characteristics of our mother's partner or our father's partner, in that, you know, role theory. But even, you know, for better or for worse, right? So even though we may recognize that those are not good qualities, or we may not, you know, but even if we do recognize that, I think we often sort of subconsciously or unconsciously find ourselves repeating those patterns, in our own relationships. Yeah. And so that's why kind of knowledge is power, right? Because you know that maybe you can recognize it a little bit more easily and figure out how to navigate the situation differently. Any other thoughts or comments on this? Okay, so I want you to kind of understand how this functions in relationships and be able to think about it, talk about it, write about it, as we're moving towards our finals. Wow. All right, I'm gonna shift gears then to recap on the second part of last week, which was issues related to planning for parenthood, right? And again, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but you know, you looked at some issues related to family planning, you know, number of children to have, when to have children, if you're not able to have children, things like adoption, you know, all of those different choices. But I want to just kind of focus on that article that you read about the shift that we've observed in families across the world, and their, you know, rates of reproduction and having children. Would anyone be willing to share kind of their take home message from what you read about that? So the discussion questions asked you for some reasons that women globally are choosing not to marry or have children. So the trend that we're seeing is people are having fewer children, much fewer children, right, than they did historically, than they have historically. So what's contributing to that? Sydney?
Isn't it mostly due to like a career choice over family choice kind of?
Yeah, a lot of the, you know, issues and trends that we've talked about thus far are at play here. So we see people delaying marriage, likely because either they're in school for longer as a precursor to a career, or they have, you know, career obligations and things like that. that are kind of taking precedence over the family situation. And then that certainly plays into why women are choosing, to have either fewer or no children. And there are a lot of other factors related to that. I think childcare, lack of childcare, lack of quality childcare, cost of childcare, there's a lot of factors outside of just do I or when do I have children, but it's like, how do we kind of navigate having children in this world where both parents are working and outside the home. And then, it's just, I want to kind of point out that the video or the video that you watched around this idea, it really speaks to the reproductive rates in some countries are so low that, researchers are sort of pushing ideas for how populations will continue to exist, right? If the reproduction rate is less than the amount of people, who are that generation that's dying off, essentially, the society itself doesn't continue if this trend continues. And so does anyone remember recommendations that might shift this dynamic so that people would kind of resume having children to some extent? One of them was what I just mentioned, right, related to childcare, that there need to be better childcare options, more affordable childcare options. And then I think another huge piece of that, because again, this is primarily related to career and, kind of the necessity of having two working parents, but it's family-friendly workplace policies, right? In the United States, mothers traditionally get 6 weeks of maternity leave. And I can tell you from experience that 6 week mark is the point at which your infant is really just starting to wake up and interact in the world. And so, you've spent 4 or 5 weeks at home with a sleeping infant. And then just as they're beginning to come alive and, interact with you and things like that, you're expected to put them in childcare and go back to work full time. And often workplace policies don't support paternity leave at all, so, and there's been some shift towards doing better in the US. There are some countries who do it pretty well, but, globally speaking, those are some of the kind of issues that surround this idea. Any questions or comments on this piece before we move on? No? All right. So today we're going to dig into parenting a little bit more. Last week, you looked at kind of decisions related to becoming a parent. And then today we're going to be talking about once we are parenting, some issues, that kind of come out of that experience. So it's chapter 12 in your text called Diversity in Parenting. And mostly we're going to spend our time talking about, we'll talk about the transition to parenthood and some challenges that mothers and fathers might face. We will look at some child rearing theories, talk about different parenting styles and techniques. And then I kind of want to focus on principles of effective parenting. Because just because you're a parent doesn't mean you're an effective one. And again, knowledge is power. And sometimes we don't have the model that we would hope to become the type of parent for our children. And so, understanding what all goes into being a quote unquote good parent. Sorry. Oh, sounds like somebody's just coming on. All right, so first and foremost, we'll talk about parenting from a choices perspective, right? This is kind of the way that our book has presented all of these issues that we've talked about in relationships so far. So it's important to note that parenting is basically a series of constant choices and decisions, right? And even when parents choose not to act, on a child's behavior, or, not to respond to something that a child has said or done, that itself is a choice and a decision that's being made, right? Everything that you do in terms of interactions or not interacting with your children is a decision that can impact their experience. And what I mean by that is, if I choose to implement a consequence for something that my child has done, that is a guiding decision, that will influence her understanding of her behavior. In the same way that if I choose to ignore the behavior and I don't provide a consequence, that also influences her understanding of the experience and of the behavior, right? She's either learning my choices have consequences and I have to live with those, or, I get off scot-free and people just overlook when I make bad decisions. And so parents have to be really kind of on all the time so that they are not sending the wrong message to their children. Parenting choices also constantly involve trade-offs, okay? And what's meant by this is that we talked about childcare a few minutes ago. If I decide that I want to have children and I want to put them in a high-quality childcare center so that I can work outside the home, I go into that decision understanding that the cost of that childcare is going to mean a financial trade-off for my family. Because even though I may be working outside the home, making X amount of dollars, at least probably 700 of those dollars every month are going to be spent putting my child in childcare. And that's a low ball figure. So this idea of trade-offs, and that's just one example. There are lots of examples. Sending a child to kindergarten. If you have a child whose my daughter's birthday is September 1st, right? And so she missed the public school cutoff by one day, but if her birthday was August 28th, I have to make a decision. Do I send her to kindergarten as, well, I guess it would be a different birthday earlier in the year. You can make choices about, do you send your child to kindergarten at 5 or 6 years old? And the trade-off there is, do I have a child who's a little bit more socially and emotionally developed when I put them into the institution of public school, or do I, keep them in childcare or at home for an extra year? Those type of choices, again, involve a trade-off. And then the financial piece comes in again, because if you keep them at home, you're paying a financial cost for that in one way, shape, or another, than if you go ahead and send them to school. But basically, many parenting choices are like this, right? They involve the giving up of one thing in order to gain another, or vice versa. The third point on reframing, we've kind of touched on this along the way in other chapters and related to other content, but reframing is this, it's basically, a life skill. It can apply to parenting, it can apply to all areas of thinking, but it's basically kind of, finding the silver lining or overlooking negative experiences, poor choices that you might have made in order to see the good, so you're trying to find the good in decisions that you've made as a parent, or outcomes of maybe missteps along the way. I do think it's really, really critical. And, my lived experience as we're coming kind of out of the pandemic has been that society and cultural shifts and trends and things that happen to us at the macro level, that happen to everyone, either globally or nationally or whatever, the way that trickles down into your parenting decisions, you don't necessarily kind of recognize it until it's happening. But I mean, COVID, think about the influence that COVID had on parenting. People were making huge decisions about, school, when and where their children were going to go out of the home, and all those things that, are kind of a direct result of society and cultural shifts influencing parenting. And that happens in a lot of other ways. I think technology is another piece here where, it's that thread that we've kind of seen woven throughout the course all semester is the shift in our relationship dynamics because of technology, but that definitely plays into parenting today more than it did even a couple of years ago, I would say. And then it's also, I spoke about ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, or adverse childhood events a few minutes ago, but those do include physical, sexual, emotional abuse or neglect. And it's important to note that parents can be a protective factor against ACEs for children. But on the flip side of that, parents can also, be sort of they can be the cause of these ACEs as well. So I think understanding what an adverse childhood experience is, what constitutes that for a child, and then how do we protect our children from those experiences is really important as you think about, shifting into parenthood. There is an idea brought out in the text about the good enough parent. And the good enough parent is basically, it comes from research that someone in 1953, it was a psychoanalyst, Winnicott. Pretty much what he said is that perfection in parenting is not possible, and it's actually not even ideal, right? Good enough is good enough. And the idea is that you want to provide love, security, and structure for a child, but becoming obsessive about the role of parenting or striving to be a perfect parent can have negative impacts on the parent, and might, result in loss of identity or feelings of too much pressure around parenting. So I think saying, good enough is good enough. I say that to my children sometimes, actually. I'm doing the best that I can, and good enough is good enough. And then the text also talks about the 4 basic C's. And so this is kind of across culture and across, different societies. These are the 4 ideals that promote positive development in young children. These are the things that parents do that relate to positive outcomes. So they provide care in both a physical and emotional way. They provide consistency. Children, in the same way that I was talking about reinforcement, and then that, aperiodic reinforcement, that's very confusing for people, right? So children need to know what to expect when they behave a certain way, or when they, engage in a certain behavior. What's the outcome going to be? They also need to be able to predict their daily routines, and highly inconsistent experiences for children do not result in positive outcomes. Good parents also provide choices, and this is because children need to feel some sense of control and kind of competence in their own lives. So giving children ways, of course, to make safe choices. They don't need, they don't need to make choices that they're not ready for, but children do need to be given choice in their lives. And then they also need consequences. They need to understand the effects of their choices. And so be familiar with these 4 C's and how they relate to parenthood. And then the 7 basic parenting choices that are talked about in the text, we've already kind of touched on number 1 and number 2. It's whether or not we will even have children, and then if so, how many children are we going to have? Kind of related to that is what will be the time span, between these children, and that's a kind of an important factor when you think about sibling relationships and all the different things that go into that dynamic. So intervals between children, length of time between having them, and then the rest of these issues kind of get into co-parenting ideas. So parents, or even a single parent, has to decide what's the type of discipline or guidance that I'm going to implement in my child's life. And we'll talk in a few minutes about different parenting styles, and that will certainly influence the method of discipline. But, some parents choose more of like a corporal punishment approach where they believe in spanking, very punitive type of discipline. And then other people, choose more of a conversational, redirective approach to discipline. But there's a whole lot of information out there, and eventually you'll either make those decisions on the front end, or you'll make them in the moment. But the method of discipline will be decided on in the parenting relationship. And one decision might be no discipline at all. That's a parenting style that we'll talk about. And so some parents choose to just take a very permissive approach to parenting. So number 5 and 6 are sort of interrelated in terms of thinking about how much energy and engagement will be invested in children. And then within a relationship, within any type of partner relationship raising children, there's also this decision around who will be the primary caregiver and who will be sort of, responsible for other things, maybe work outside the home, or sometimes there's more of a traditional disciplinarian in the relationship. And then there tends to be more of like the fun parent. But those are all decisions that parents, again, either kind of in an unspoken way or in a very overt way, people do make those choices. And then finally, choices around technology becoming ever important in parenting, as I've already said. Anybody have thoughts or anything to add to this? What we've touched on so far? I included a video link here. I think this is really telling about the technology piece. It's just 3 minutes. But let me, am I sharing my screen? No. Okay.
In our home, we have 2 TVs, an iPad mini. We have 2 Leap pads. My husband and I each have a cell phone.
We have 3 TVs, 2 laptops, 4 iPads, and 2 cell phones.
2 smartphones, 1 iPad, 1 Samsung tablet, 1 smart TV, 1 Google Home, 2 old school TVs. In our home, we have a television, an iPad, and 2 smartphones.
My kids probably spend 3 hours at least a day.
Maybe 4 to 6 hours a day.
1 to 2 hours, 40 minutes to 1 hour.
She likes to watch things on YouTube.
She really loves Minions, and she really loves Moana.
They play a lot of games.
Sometimes he goes on Netflix.
Even Elijah, he knows the iPad and knows how to swipe.
I think devices and media have definitely changed parenting. It's enabled us to be able to do things like my husband and I sleeping in.
I'm a single parent, and the phone has become a way for me to occupy her when I'm trying to cook, when I'm commuting, when I need to take a shower. If he follows the rules, then he gets iPad time.
There are times when the boys acts up, and just recently we took their iPads away for a month.
I do have concerns that, with things like SpongeBob, there's definitely violence.
Even commercials nowadays, like my eldest would ask, why are they dressed that way?
He was just like going to YouTube, but the stuff that he was being suggested to watch were completely inappropriate for his age.
I absolutely think that there is educational value to digital media. One of the shows actually that my kids have been really into is Wild Kratts. And my daughter knows more than I have ever known about animals from watching that show.
When he was little, we used the bilingual apps so he could learn Spanish and practice. I recently started using some coding websites.
There are times when they would ask about, what city, where's Egypt? And so I'd use my app to show Google Earth, and then we'd zoom in to show Egypt.
In terms of using TV time as special time with him, we'll do a Friday movie night. I noticed that after the movie's done, he wants to talk about the movie. He wants to kind of relate what he watched.
He really likes having me or my husband play with him, and so we frequently will play together.
We have a competition. Me and Nathan is one team, and my wife and Ezekiel is another.
What is it? I try to read with her every night. She has a couple of favorite books that she's gotten to the point that she's memorized them, so she can sort of read them to me.
As my kids get older, I really hope that they will learn how to use media responsibly.
That he uses media to learn new things.
And my hope is that they know the value of the outside world, that you need to go out.
Most of all, I hope that she's happy.
Anybody willing to talk about or chat about what they saw or heard in that video clip related to technology? Someone said some children that I babysit are not allowed screen time at all, really. It's kind of crazy that they don't gravitate towards it when it's offered. They would rather color or play. Would you be willing to share more about that, Morgan?
Yeah, I can. It's kind of like a lot to type. I'm just not feeling the greatest, so that's why I've been typing in the chat. But so it's really kind of crazy because the little boy, he's 2, and then they have a daughter and she's 5, and they've sort of never really cared too much about like having an iPad, or like they don't try to grab your phones and stuff. And I think it's just that they were never offered it really in the first place, so they don't really know what it is. Like sometimes I have to like turn a TV show on my phone to like get the little boy to calm down, because he loves to like run and play and just like do whatever he can get his hands on. And sometimes it's like I have to turn on something on my phone for him to calm down. Because even like the TV sometimes won't calm him down. But the older girl, she like her mom will try to get her to like sit down and watch a movie. It's rare, but sometimes it happens. And she's like, she always asks me like, can you go get the coloring book and the crayons? Like she would rather play with a toy or just something she can find or come up with than like watch YouTube, which they're not allowed to watch YouTube at all.
Right.
Like they even have iPads, but they're dead 95% of the time because they just don't care about them.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, I can speak to that from my own experience as well. I think that the more exposure to screens that children have, and from the younger age, in that video, we saw children as young as 1 swiping on iPads, all the way up to, 8-year-olds that were spending 4 to 6 hours a day on screens, but I think that range of exposure really does play a part in terms of how much children are invested in screens. My own children, I limited it a ton with my first, and then by the time she was 3, almost 3, when my second child was born, and so at that point she was watching a movie here and there or whatever, but there tended to be a little bit more kind of background noise of technology in our home with the second one coming up. But I very rarely intentionally sat my children in front of a screen, and the times that I did try to do that, what I found, it was more frustrating for me, because I would put a movie on and hope that they would sit and watch it, and they just didn't care about it at all. They would rather be up playing, moving, doing things. And so, yeah, I kind of think that the more children do that, and then, we heard in the video, some parents kind of relying on that. That's one of the single parent issues, that when you don't have another partner in the home to kind of help give attention or, bounce that time expenditure off of, I think people do have to rely on screen time and technology kind of in a way that other parents might not. And so, that's an issue in and of itself, is how it can serve as kind of a babysitter. And then I think the more people do that, the more they might tend to rely on it. And then the more children kind of crave media and technology. But I do want to point out and be very clear about the fact that, and there's a ton of research out there around, media and young children. But these families also spoke to some positive aspects of media, right? So there's a lot of educational value. We heard about children becoming, exposed to multiple languages and looking at, research on geography and things like that, that you simply can't do without the use of technology. And so again, I think it's just one of those things that you have to be really kind of clear about what are your intentions for using technology with your children. And then it's an area of parenthood where people need to be diligent to make it what they want it to be, right? So a mom spoke about YouTube and kind of the suggested content that comes up. You can't monitor all of that. And so, you need to have kind of clear cut parameters around what's going to be acceptable and how you're going to navigate that with and for your children.
I would like to add one other thing. So when there is like a situation where, like, if I were to have to step away to like make them lunch or something, when I am babysitting them, like the 5-year-old's really great with like making sure her brother's like being safe. She's like his little protector. But like if I need to step away from them to like make something, the only way that I can get them to like sit down and actually watch something where they're in view is like I have to give them a snack. They won't like sit and watch something or like stop playing unless I offer them a snack. So they always have to have like some kind of snack to keep them like in one spot, if that makes sense, because they have like so many like books and toys and stuff. They never stick to one thing for like more than 5 minutes, but they because they love to play, and if it's nice outside, they want to go outside and play. They want to run around because they have a lot of energy. Those two kids, and it's hard to keep up with them sometimes.
Sure.
But to keep them like in one spot, I have to give them a snack. I've like discovered.
Well, and that's really interesting. I don't want to read too much into any of that, but I will point out 2 things that I kind of heard you say that are issues that are talked about in early childhood research and child development in general. First and foremost is the idea of attention span and like overstimulating children. So there is research that suggests that less is kind of more, and that children with so many options maybe don't necessarily focus and attend to one for any significant length of time. So that's an interesting observation. And then this idea of eating as it relates to sitting still, watching TV and snacking kind of in a mindless eating way. So there's like a whole lot of research around mindful eating and how it relates to childhood obesity. And anyways, and I'm not suggesting at all that those parents are doing anything that might have negative implications for their children, but I will point out that those are all kind of current events, current issues in the field that are being talked about because they are so related to all of our different parenting experiences. I'm not going to have enough time probably to talk too much about this transition, but go back into your chapter in chapter 12 and make sure you read about the transition to motherhood has its own term in the social sciences. It's called matrescence, and it's looked at in the same way that adolescence is sort of looked at. It's a major transition in physical development. There's a hormonal impact that causes some cognitive changes in mothers as they become mothers. And so understand kind of what all goes into that shift for women, and then also for men, right? Because even though men don't do the physical piece of carrying a child and birthing a child, there's huge shifts that also happen as a man embarks on the journey of fatherhood, right? So understand what happens for each of the genders, and then also couple to family shifts, right? So there's a whole other piece of the pie that happens when a couple, a dyad becomes a triad or more, and what that might mean for families making that shift. Some parental roles. I think most of these are pretty straightforward in terms of what we understand parents do for or with their children. The last one, so basically, you know, we're protecting children, we're an emotional resource for children, we're teaching them in the home, even though they have formal teachers probably outside of the home. Economic resources that, you know, parents assume the cost of basic care and provision for their children. Parents should be promoting healthy habits. And then this ritual bearer idea, this is sort of parents in the role of creating things, experiences, memories that bond the family unit together and create a sense of belonging, help the child form memories. So some examples of that might be prayers before mealtime, special holiday traditions, Friday night movie night or game night, or anything like that, you know, you can probably look back on your own childhood and think about some of those rituals that you had in your home. And that's what is meant by this idea of being the ritual bearer as a parent, right? I do want to talk about the different parenting styles. So I'll just kind of name them really quickly: authoritarian, permissive, authoritative, and then there's a fourth one that is now called uninvolved. It at one time was called neglectful. But these are parenting styles, and they're based on two dimensions of responsiveness and demandingness, okay? So authoritarian parents are very demanding and not necessarily very responsive. They are high demand parents, maybe kind of middle or low response parents. Permissive parents are sort of the opposite. They're very low demand, and they might be highly responsive, right? Uninvolved is very straightforward. It's exactly what it sounds like. And I want you to know that authoritative parents who are sort of moderate in terms of how they demand of their children, but also how they respond to their children, authoritative parents have the best outcomes when you look at child development across the board, right? And so authoritative parents enforce consequences, but in a very loving and gentle way. They do have high expectations of behavior, but again, not because it's my way and I said so, do it because I, you know, authoritarian parents are kind of the, I'm going to give you something to cry about type of parents, or you just do it because I said so, you know. But authoritative, they might have similar expectations, they're just coming at it from a different approach. So if that's interesting to you, there's a ton of research out there on parenting styles and outcomes related to parenting styles. You know, what that looks like, feels like in a relationship, but important to know and understand. There's a graphic in here about what positive parenting looks like. And then the last few slides are just kind of this laundry list from the textbook about effective parenting, right? A lot of it we've kind of touched on already. I will say responding creatively to teenagers is an important issue. I think, you know, teenagers are kind of their own whole thing. And so, you know, understanding how they operate, how they think, how they function, what they want is important in terms of, you know, navigating the parent relationship. And I've included a video clip here on the last slide. Actually, I don't think you guys can see that. I'll go back in and add it to the course page because it's just like a 4 or 5 minute video of a teenager talking about how to parent teenagers. And I think she has some really valuable things to say. So we won't have time to watch it together, but I will put that up for you. And then, yeah, I think that's pretty much the gist of what I wanted you to get out of today. So if you'll type your names into the chat, make sure that I have you here. And I see that someone was asking about reflections 6 to 10 being due. I'm probably just going to have those. I don't know that I've set a due date for those. I'll probably just give you until reading day. So whatever date that is, go ahead and just count them as being due on reading day. And I'll get that added to the course page so that it's clear for everyone. Last minute questions, thoughts, ideas?
What day is reading day? Is that the 27th?
I don't, is it the 27th? Does anybody know? I might have it right here. Hold on. I don't have an academic calendar in front of me. I am not sure. And actually, so I have on the syllabus, I have the reflection 6 to 10 being due on April 21st. I'll just get it. We'll have them due on reading day, and I'll post to the course page what that date is. Because without looking, I don't know. Someone said they think it's the 28th. I'll clarify for you guys. But it's also, you know, available online.
Okay.
And then for the asynchronous day, there is nothing that you have to do. Just review the content, read your chapter 13, and then there's a video posted that has a lot of good information in it, but you don't have to do a discussion or anything related to that. Okay. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Mhm.